By dawn, her fingers had gone so numb she could not feel the brass corners of the trunk, yet she kept one hand on it as the Bath coach lurched through freezing rain and through mud against her hem. The trunk was hers only by label, a narrow box with her late father's initials half scraped away, and even that small claim had to be dragged beside the wheels like contraband, because she was not permitted to ride with it or with anyone else. Mrs. Kelly's written instruction lay folded in Linda's pocket, dry only because she had pressed it beneath her stays all night. She was to walk, to keep pace, to arrive at Ravenscar House before dark, and to return only when ordered. If she failed, the attic room would be locked and the key removed. The coachman had read the note once, frowned at her shoes, and then looked away in the manner of men who did not wish to touch household cruelty if they could avoid it. So she walked. Her shoes filled at once. Water crept through split leather and settled around her toes, cold first, then sharp, then dull. Her shawl had thinned to gauze at the folds, and each gust found the same gap near her collarbone where the stitching had given way. Behind the steamed glass of the coach windows, faces turned toward her, then from her, then back again when the road jolted and she stumbled. She was 22 years old, hungry since yesterday morning, and trying not to limp because limping invited commentary from strangers who believed discomfort in poor relations was a sort of weather, unavoidable and faintly amusing. At the first rise beyond the toll gate, one of the gentlemen inside rapped on the pane and called through the crack left by a lowered sash, his smile broad with the shelter of dry wool and polished boots. "Mrs. Kelly's plain little dependent will dissolve before devises," a lady beside him laughed into her glove. Another voice, male and younger, answered, "Dependent? I thought she was hired." The words were not loud, yet the rain carried them well enough. Linda kept her eyes on the wheel rut ahead and moved the trunk when the coach leaned, keeping it clear of the spokes by inches. She had learned where to place her body in relation to moving things that could crush without noticing. She had learned it in passageways, in kitchens, in drawing rooms where her presence was tolerated if silent and reproved if visible. Plain, they called her, and she had heard it so often it arrived like a household bell, regular and exact. Plain dark hair, plain large eyes that watched too much, plain narrow face that looked thinner each month. What they never named was the discipline with which she held her mouth when her teeth wanted to chatter, or the way she kept her back straight even while pulling weight through mud that sucked at each step. Her knuckles were split from yesterday's scrubbing and this morning's rope burn. Her wrists ached where the trunk handle dug in. Hunger made her breath shallow and her temper hot for one dangerous second, and then she pressed it down because temper had a cost, and she had no margin left for costs. She heard the lady in the coach say, almost kindly, "She ought to be in service if she insists upon looking so entirely like it," and the gentleman answer, "She is in service, merely without wages," and then the window slid shut on their warmth. The road dipped and rose and dipped again, and the rhythm of her steps drew up memories she did not invite but could not prevent. 3 years earlier her father had still been alive and dictating figures over breakfast, salt in his beard, thumb blackened by ink, laughing when she corrected an entry faster than his clerk. He had owned 2 small ships and half of a warehouse near Bristol, and on winter evenings he taught her to balance cargo ledgers, because numbers, he said, did not flatter and did not pity. They told the truth if one looked long enough. Then fever took him in 6 days. The physician left. Men came with papers. Mrs. Kelly, widowed in name only, and practised in command, took the keys from the housekeeper ring and the silver from the sideboard, and announced that the will was under dispute, and prudence required economies. Prudence became locked cupboards. Prudence became no fire in Linda's room, except on Sundays. Prudence became the attic nursery, where the ceiling sloped so low she struck her head each time she forgot to bend near the eaves. Her mother had been gone since Linda was 12, buried in a churchyard 2 parishes over, and there was no elder aunt to protest, no brother to object. Mrs. Kelly sold Linda's dowry silk by the yard and told guests the girl had no taste for finery. Meals were served downstairs in courses and in sequence, while a crust and weak tea waited near the scullery door, if no one remembered to remove it first. Public errands multiplied whenever county company gathered. Carry this parcel through market at noon. Fetch this ribbon from the draper everyone can see. Deliver this note to Lady Wren, where all her callers might ask why she was wet, unchaperoned, and dressed like a dismissed maid. Each errand was a lesson conducted in full view. Linda performed each one because refusal brought the slap, the lock, the sentence spoken without heat. You may sleep in the stable if the attic displeases you. She had not cried in front of them since the first winter. Tears spent before witnesses became tools in another person's hand. By mid-morning the rain sharpened to sleet and then softened again, a miserly reprieve that lasted 1 mile before wind drove water sideways under her shawl. At a posting stop near Melksham, she was permitted no stool by the kitchen fire while horses were changed. The guard pointed with his chin toward the yard wall and told her not to bring mud inside. She stood where coal smoke and wet hay mingled, flexing her fingers one by one to keep them from locking. A boy carrying pails stared at her torn sleeve, then at the trunk, then away. She lifted the trunk onto a loading stone and checked the cord binding, not because anyone asked, but because if it split, if papers were lost, if wax seals broke, the blame would travel home faster than she could. The packet for Ravenscar House rested against her ribs, sealed in dark red and marked with Mrs. Kelly's hard, slanted hand. Deliver before nightfall, no delays, no excuses. She repeated the line with each breath, a discipline to keep fear from becoming dizziness. When the coach rolled out again, she resumed her place at its flank as if tethered there. Mud climbed from hem to knee. The skin beneath her collar burned where wet wool rubbed. Once, on a sharp descent, the trunk skidded and struck her shin with enough force to make sparks flash behind her eyes. She steadied it before it tipped, inhaled through her teeth, and kept moving. No one on the road would have named this labour. They would have called it travel, perhaps misfortune, perhaps consequence. They would not have called it what it was. Punishment made logistical, cruelty arranged into timetables and distances so that it resembled ordinary household management. Near noon, traffic thickened toward a coaching inn where messengers changed horses for London and Bath, and the yard opened before her in a churn of hoofs, shouted numbers and steaming flanks. Wheels hissed through standing water. Ostlers ran bent beneath harness. A hawker cried hot pies she could not buy, and the smell of pepper and meat turned her stomach hollow and mean. She drew back from a swinging trace chain, dragged the trunk under the eaves of a stone arch, and set it down with care because care was the last form of ownership she still possessed. Her right hand had swollen across the knuckles. A crescent cut at the base of her thumb had reopened and left thin red lines that rain thinned at once. She took off one glove, wrung it, pulled it on again, and read the folded order another time, though she knew every word. Mrs. Kelly had written the final sentence, larger than the rest. "Fail me, and you forfeit your bed." The ink had blotted where the pen paused before bed, as though even the threat required emphasis. Linda tucked the paper away and lifted her chin toward the inn door, where polished boots crossed and recrossed the threshold without once glancing at the woman in soaked calico beside the trunk. She had been made conspicuous by design and invisible by custom, displayed and dismissed in the same breath. Around her, strangers judged cloth, posture, accent, and decided what she was worth before she moved. She shifted the trunk closer to the wall, feeling hunger claw and then settle, and waited for the next coachman willing to take one unpaid passenger's burden farther north. Nightfall was a fixed point. Ravenscar House lay beyond it, and the road between was long. A wagon backed too close to the arch and splashed her skirt to the thigh, and Linda shifted the trunk by inches so the wheel did not crack its corner, then stood again with both hands on the lid, as if the box might drift away from her in the tide of men and harness and wet stone. The yard was loud enough to shake her ribs, yet inside that noise the old arithmetic of her life arranged itself with its usual pitiless order, because waiting always made memory sharper, and this wait had the taste of command in it. Her mother had died in March rain that smelled like this, rain running off slates into the courtyard, while candles burned down in the upstairs bedchamber, and no one spoke above a whisper for 3 days. Linda had been 12 and too young to understand how quickly a household changed shape when the gentlest pair of hands in it were folded and gone. Her father held the house together for a time by force of attention alone. He rose early. He checked every account himself. He noticed when a maid was limping and when a cook had overpaid for flour. He noticed when Linda read by firelight past midnight and never told her to stop. Then came the second marriage, practical by everyone's account, proper by every parish measure, and in the first months even tolerable, because Mrs. Kelly arrived with soft speech and gloves that smelled of rosewater, and a manner so composed that neighbours called her steady, said she would be good for a man burdened by trade and grief. Linda had wanted to believe them. She had watched Mrs. Kelly lay out fresh linens in the blue room and oversee preserving jars in August, and she had thought steadiness might be a kind of mercy. It lasted less than a season. The corrections began in small public cuts, each one deniable. "Not that ribbon, Linda, it cheapens your complexion. Not that seat at table, child, you distract your father from his business. Not that opinion, my dear, you are young and do not understand household strategy." Her father laughed once and told them both there would be no strategy in his house except honesty and paid invoices. But the laugh did not come again after winter. Mrs. Kelly learned where influence lay, in keys, in schedules, in who entered his study and who was told to wait. Linda would bring a question and be informed he was resting. She would bring a ledger and be informed he was occupied. She would carry tea up herself and be turned back at the landing by a calm voice and a closed door. When guests came, Mrs. Kelly placed Linda where she could be seen and discounted in the same glance. Never enough cruelty to scandalize, always enough to teach. By the time Linda was 18, she had stopped reaching for the housekeeper's ring when a storeroom needed opening, because the ring was no longer passed through the household by habit, but kept on Mrs. Kelly's wrist like jewellery. By 19, she had learned that the 2 daughters from Mrs. Kelly's first marriage understood this new map better than anyone. Miss Helena, with her bright laugh and ivory combs, Miss Clara, with her careful mimicry of whatever tone their mother used that morning. They took, without touching at first, a place by the fire, a new pelisse ordered on credit, then called a necessary expense, a set of pearl drops said to be borrowed, then never returned. Later they took what could be held, Linda's mother's shawl folded from cedar and declared old-fashioned, her silver-backed brush found suddenly in Helena's room with no memory of how it arrived, her winter boots relabelled for Clara because the leather was finer and she was the more social girl. Each theft was wrapped in etiquette. Each protest, if voiced, became ingratitude. Linda learned silence not from meekness, but from pattern recognition. She saw what happened to truth when spoken at the wrong table. Her father's death made that pattern law. Fever came in July, fierce and brief. On the third day he tried to sit up and ask for the Bristol schedule. On the fourth he mistook Linda for his sister and asked why the tide was late. On the sixth the physician bowed his head and removed his spectacles, and the room went quiet in a way that still visited her at odd hours, the kind of quiet that did not end when the door shut. After the mourning ribbons were cut and pinned, papers multiplied. Men she barely knew arrived with ledgers under one arm and condolences under the other. The will was read in a drawing room that smelled of lilies and damp wool. There was language of trusts and guardianship, language of disputed obligations attached to vessels delayed in port, language that placed the estate in temporary management until claims were settled. Temporary became a corridor with no visible door. Mrs. Kelly spoke often of debts. She spoke of prudence, of sacrifice, of the burden she had accepted for the sake of all concerned. Linda saw the shipping ledger once in those first weeks, opened on her father's desk, margins crowded with entries not in his hand. 2 cargo lines transposed, a freight total copied twice. A figure that should have reduced liability moved to the opposite column and made it swell. She pointed to the error. Mrs. Kelly laid one finger over the page and smiled with no warmth. "You mistake ambition for competence," she said, then closed the book. The clerk, who had once brought Linda spare quills, stopped meeting her eyes. Within a month wages were cut, pending review. Then 2 old servants were dismissed, one for age and one for insolence no one had witnessed. Within 2 months, Linda's allowance vanished as unnecessary. Within 3, her room downstairs was assigned to Clara for better light, and the attic nursery was offered as a sensible arrangement for a dependent with no immediate prospects. Dependent became the household word. It sat where her name should have been. At breakfast, if she was admitted, Mrs. Kelly asked in front of callers whether dependents were wise to take butter at present prices. At supper, if there was supper, Helena would remark that plain girls did best on plain portions, and laugh when Clara repeated it. The baker's account was always paid for the front table and mysteriously short for the back stairs. Linda took to keeping crusts in a handkerchief under her mattress, not from greed but from calculation. 1 crust before dawn made steadier hands on a day of errands. Errands were chosen for witness value. Carry invoices through market at peak hour. Stand in queue at the butcher with servants from houses where she had once been introduced as Miss Kelly. Deliver notes that could have gone by footman, but were sent by her hand so questions might be asked and answered publicly. "Is Mrs. Kelly unwell, Miss Linda?" "No, Lady Wren, she is occupied." "Are matters difficult since your father passed?" "I am sure they are being handled." "Is it true the estate is imperilled?" "I am not invited to financial discussions." She learned to make each answer sound like deference when it was only boundary. At night she copied numbers from memory onto scraps torn from old correspondence and hid them in the lining of the trunk now beside her. Because even if no one listened yet, the figures ought to survive someone's attempt to erase them. She had her father's discipline, if not his authority. She had his habit of evidence. The yard bell clanged for a departure and jolted her back to the present, to rain needling her scalp through loose hair, and to the packet pressed against her ribs like a second pulse, and she realised her jaw had locked from cold and from the effort of holding all those years at arm's length while men shouted for teams, and ladies stepped around puddles with lifted hems, and did not once look toward the woman guarding a splintered trunk under the arch. This was how the degradation worked, not as one catastrophe, but as repetition, 100 small denials that trained everyone nearby to call it ordinary. Mrs. Kelly had refined it into method by now. Food withheld not absolutely, but unpredictably, so gratitude could be demanded for any scrap. Labour assigned not privately, but where witnesses could convert it into gossip. Punishment delivered without raised voice, because calm cruelty looked like discipline to outsiders. If Linda spoke sharply, she was unstable. If she spoke softly, she admitted fault. If she held silence, she confirmed the story written for her. Even the attic had been selected for its symbolism. The nursery where she had once slept under painted stars, now stripped to bare boards, and a narrow cot, childhood converted to penance. On damp nights, water tracked down the inner wall and soaked the blanket edge. On frost mornings, the basin skinned over before she washed. Once, when she asked for coal after 3 days of hard freeze, Mrs. Kelly replied, "Warmth is earned through usefulness," and sent her to inventory moth-eaten curtains in an unheated corridor until her fingers went white. Helena and Clara learned from this schooling with eager exactness. They tried on her dresses before guests and declared them unsuitable to her colouring. They borrowed books from her shelf and returned them with pages torn where her father had written notes in the margins. They stood at her door in the evenings and repeated parlour conversations in bright voices, selecting each phrase for injury. Poor child, no dowry now, fortunate to be kept at all. Linda did not answer. She mended sleeves by candle stubs and read account fragments until the words blurred, because numbers still obeyed rules even when people did not. Last week, Mrs. Kelly had entered the attic without knocking, silk whispering against the frame, rosewater preceding her like heraldry. She had set the sealed packet on the cot and said, "Ravenscar House before nightfall tomorrow. You will travel as arranged. If you are late, your bed is forfeit. If the seal is broken, your trunk is burned. Do not test me." Linda had looked at the packet, at the red wax and hard slanted hand, and understood that this errand was designed the way the others had been designed, to expose, to exhaust, to remind her that shelter could be revoked with a sentence. Yet there had been that other understanding beneath it, quieter and more dangerous. Ravenscar House meant legal offices, steward books, names that touch the disputed trust. A sealed packet sent in haste meant urgency, perhaps fear. Mrs. Kelly did not fear often. The knowledge had settled in Linda like flint. She was cold now, hungry now, wet through now, and still that flint remained. She shifted the trunk again, checked the cord once more, and when a passing ostler muttered that she should leave heavy work to men, she answered with formal politeness that the burden was hers and would remain so, then lifted her chin towards the coach line and waited for the road to move, carrying not merely a packet, but the accumulated weight of a house, taken room by room, name by name, until almost nothing was left except her memory, her father's training, and the stubborn, disciplined refusal to vanish. She had just shifted her weight to lift the trunk again when a body struck the archway beside her with a dull, human thud, heavy enough to jar the stone and send a spray of rainwater down her sleeve. Men in the yard turned at the sound, looked once, then looked away with the practised indifference reserved for drunken gentlemen and public inconveniences. The figure caught himself against the wall with one gloved hand. The other reached for her wrist in the same motion, hard, urgent, unsteady. She smelled wet wool, spirits gone sour, and the faint medicinal bitterness of laudanum beneath both. He was young, perhaps not yet 30, though strain had carved shadows under his eyes. Dark hair clung to his brow. His cravat hung loose as if tied in haste. His mouth was colourless from cold. He dragged one shaking breath and bent toward her, as if the effort of standing had already spent him. "Leave now," he said, each word clipped against a tremor he could not master. "If my brother finds you here, Mrs. Kelly will use you to ruin us both." His grip tightened once, then faltered. The shake ran through him like a current, not the ordinary shiver of rain, but a violent rhythmic tremor that reached his shoulder and jaw. Linda did not pull away. She looked at his hand around her sleeve, at the signet ring half hidden by mud, at the engraved blackthorn crest she had seen only on sealed invitations delivered to brighter doors than hers. The yard noise swelled and narrowed, wheels hissed, horses stamped. Somewhere behind her a porter laughed at some private remark, and the sound landed obscenely bright against the man's face. "Why are you trembling, my lord?" she asked. His eyes met hers then, startlingly clear for a moment, storm-grey and bloodshot at once. Shame flashed there before anger covered it. "I am cold," he said. "That is all." "You are not merely cold. Do not contradict me." The command came thin and breathless. "You have no notion what this place is or who watches it." She felt the tremor worsen through his fingers. His knees buckled. He released her wrist as if burned and tried to straighten, failed and caught at the air where her shoulder had been. She moved before thought could intervene, dropping to the stones as he folded downward. His temple struck her collarbone instead of the cobbles because she turned into the fall and took the impact. Pain shot through her already bruised arm. She ignored it. She lowered him as carefully as space allowed, one hand at his neck, one bracing his shoulder clear of a puddle, black with carriage grease. "Sir, hear me." She loosened the knot of his cravat with numb fingers. "Breathe slowly." His lashes fluttered. His breath came in short, tearing pulls. Not quite seizure. Not quite faint. Something between panic and collapse, body warring against itself. A groom edged closer, frowned, then retreated when he recognized quality in the cut of the coat. No one wished to touch rank in distress unless ordered. Two ladies passing under the opposite eaves paused long enough to stare at Linda, kneeling in mud with a gentleman's head in her lap, then moved on with their mouths tight in scandalized lines. The yard had given her humiliation all day. Now it gave her an audience for this. "Fetch water," she called to the nearest stable boy without looking up. The boy stared. "Now!" He ran. The gentleman made a low sound between his teeth and tried to push himself upright. His arm jerked once, then again, hand opening and closing in empty air, as if grasping reins no longer there. "Adrian!" The name was not hers. It cracked across the yard like a whip. Heads turned as one toward the gate. A black horse came through the churned mud at a hard pace and stopped in 3 clean strides beneath the inn sign. The rider dismounted before the groom reached him. Boots hit stone, tall, broad-shouldered beneath a rain-dark greatcoat, hat brim shadowing a face carved into stillness. Everything about him was controlled motion, economical and severe. He crossed the yard without hurry and without yielding a single inch of path to anyone in it. Men who had ignored Linda all morning stepped back from him instinctively. Everyone knew that profile even when soaked and half obscured by rain. The Duke of Blackthorn stopped over them and looked down first at his brother's face, then at Linda's hands, at Adrian's throat where she had loosened linen for breath, then at the mud up her sleeves and the trunk against the wall bearing initials rubbed nearly blank. His expression did not change. The rain struck his hat brim and ran from it in steady lines. "Stand aside," he said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Linda kept 2 fingers at Adrian's pulse and counted. Fast, irregular. She had no title, no shelter, and no protection worth naming, but she had a man collapsing in her lap, and no patience left for hierarchy performed over a failing breath. "He will choke if moved too quickly," she said, not looking up. "Give him 10 seconds." The Duke's stillness sharpened. For one suspended beat, she thought she had gone too far, and would be dragged away by sheer authority, if not by hand. Then he crouched, coat spreading dark against wet stone, and put his hand where she indicated at Adrian's wrist. His gaze cut to her face at last. Close, his eyes were colder than the rain, deep-set and relentlessly attentive. "Who are you?" "Linda Kelly." At the surname, something unreadable passed across his features, and is gone. "Of Hatherley Park?" "Yes, Your Grace." His mouth flattened. "You are shivering." It was true. Her teeth had begun to strike together between words. She clamped her jaw and returned to counting breaths. The stable boy arrived with water in a dented tin cup. Linda took it, wetted her fingers, touched Adrian's lips, then the side of his neck. Adrian flinched hard at the contact, eyes snapping open. His gaze found his brother. 4 replaced confusion so quickly it was almost a reflex. "I told her to go," he said hoarsely. "I told her before you came." The Duke did not answer him. He was watching Linda's torn sleeve where fabric had split at the seam, and the darkening marks beneath that were not from weather or work. His voice, when it came, was colder than before. "Those bruises are finger marks, not clumsiness." She went very still. Exposure had many forms. She preferred the kind she could predict. "My sleeve caught on the trunk, Your Grace." "Liar!" The word was quiet. It struck harder than if he had raised his voice. Adrian made a choking sound that might have been a laugh if there had been any humour left in him. "Do not begin with her," he whispered. "Begin with the packet." The Duke's head turned a fraction. "What packet?" Adrian's eyes moved to Linda's bodice, where the folded edge showed for an instant above wet wool before she could tuck it deeper. The Duke saw the glance. He held out his hand to her, palm up, implacable. "Give it to me." Every lesson from Mrs. Kelly flared at once. Do not surrender the sealed thing. Do not invite accusation. Do not fail the instruction written in ink thick as threat. Yet Adrian was half conscious and shaking. The Duke was already reading what she did not say, and the seal burned against her skin like a brand. "It is addressed to Ravenscar House," she said. "I am Ravenscar House." She drew the packet out slowly. Rain had dampened one edge, but the red wax held. Mrs. Kelly's slanted hand ran across the front, urgent and precise. The Duke took it without touching her fingers, snapped the seal with his thumb, and scanned the first page where he knelt. His jaw tightened once. Not surprise. Recognition. By the second page, the cold control in his face had altered into something harsher, more dangerous for being restrained. He folded the papers back into order with exact care and slid them inside his coat. Adrian closed his eyes as if expecting a blow that did not come. The Duke stood and signalled 2 footmen who had appeared at the gate with his carriage, their livery dark with rain. "Carry Lord Adrian inside. Private room. Send for Dr. Mercer. No spirits." The men moved at once. Adrian caught his brother's sleeve with a hand that would not steady. "Do not leave her here," he said, each word dragged out of effort. "If Mrs. Kelly's man sees... I heard you the first time." Adrian's grip failed. The footman lifted him, one at shoulders, one at knees, and bore him toward the inn door. His head rolled once toward Linda as if he meant to speak again, then dropped back against the servant's arm. She rose only when they had gone, knees stiff from stone and cold. The yard seemed to tilt for a moment before settling. She reached automatically for her trunk handle. The Duke stepped between her and it. "You will come with me," he said. "I must deliver that packet, Your Grace." "You have done so." "If I do not return tonight, I lose my room." His gaze held hers with unsettling precision. "If you return tonight, you lose more than a room." Rain drummed on carriage roofs. A whistle sounded from the road. Somewhere nearby, a horse struck iron on stone in a sharp, nervous rhythm. The Duke glanced once toward the archway where the public coach stood, loading and then back to her. Decision already complete. "How long have you been on the road?" She hesitated. "Since before dawn." "On foot?" "Yes." "With that trunk?" "Yes." He looked past her at the worn brass corners, the frayed cord, the handle wrapped in cloth where wood had splintered. He looked back at her shoes, split and soaked through, then at her hands, raw and reddened from cold and rope and work done without gloves fit for it. When he spoke again, the command was iron. "Into the carriage, Miss Kelly." She did not move. "My lord, I am not under your authority." His expression did not shift, but something in the set of his shoulders went rigid. He took one step closer, close enough that she felt the heat of him through rain and wind. "You are carrying evidence of fraud tied to my estates. My brother has collapsed after warning you in public. Men have already seen your face beside his on the stones. You are, whether you like it or not, under my protection now." Protection. The word landed strangely, like a language she understood in theory but had never heard applied to her. She tightened her grip on the trunk. "Mrs. Kelly will send for me." "I expect she will." "She will claim I stole those papers." "She may claim what she pleases before a magistrate." The title struck through her fatigue like cold water. Magistrate meant records, sworn statements, numbers read aloud under law instead of whispered in corridors. It also meant retaliation, exposure, the full weight of a house trained to crush dissent. Fear twisted low in her stomach. Beneath it, the old flint held. The Duke watched her face as if reading columns in a ledger, adding cost against cost. His voice dropped. Less public now, no softer. "You asked my brother why he trembled. Ask yourself why he warned you first, not me. Then decide whether you wish to wait in this yard for whoever Mrs. Kelly sends next." A coachman from the public line glanced toward them, then away too quickly. Near the gate, a man in a brown cap stood half-turned under the eaves, watching with deliberate inattention. Linda had not seen him arrive. She had seen his like before, household messenger, errand man, witness for hire. She swallowed once. "My trunk comes with me." "It does, and no one opens it without my leave." A pause, rain between them, then, "Agreed." He took the trunk himself before she could protest, lifted it as if weight were an irrelevance, and handed it to his footman at the carriage step with a brief instruction she did not catch. Then he turned back to her and offered his gloved hand, not as courtesy but as directive. She put her fingers in his because refusing now would be theatre without strategy. He steadied her as she stepped up, the touch brief and controlled. The carriage interior held dry wool, lamp oil, and the faint, clean scent of cedar. She sat on the forward bench, spine straight, despite the tremor in her legs. The Duke entered opposite and rapped once on the roof. As the carriage lurched into motion, wheels cutting through standing water, he held her gaze across the narrow space and spoke with the same brutal directness he had used in the yard. "You will tell me what Mrs. Kelly has been doing with your father's ledgers, Miss Kelly. You will tell me every figure you remember." Outside, the inn-yard fell away into rain and shouting and mud. Inside, with the packet in his coat and her trunk under his seal, there was nowhere left for Silence to hide. She held his gaze across the swaying carriage and answered at once, because silence now would be read as weakness, and she had spent too many years being read that way. June freight, the Bristol line, 72 crates, listed twice under separate manifests. The total was copied to liability instead of credit. August insurance premium entered as unpaid, though I saw the bank draft. The Duke did not look down to write. He watched her face as if testing whether memory would falter under pressure. Dates. June 16th for the duplicate crates. August 21st for the premium. There was another in September. A timber consignment marked "Storm Lost after receipt" was logged in my father's hand. Your father had died by September. Yes. Rain thudded against the roof in steady blows. The carriage lamps swung and caught the hollows beneath her cheekbones. The wet strands of dark hair stuck to her neck. The raw split across her thumb that had started bleeding again. You read ledgers, formally? He asked. My father taught me. I balanced his coastal books from my 17th year. You understand what perjury is. I understand what hunger is, Your Grace. It does not improve memory. His mouth altered by a fraction, not approval, not displeasure, calculation. The carriage hit a rut hard enough to throw her shoulder into the panel. She did not make a sound. He reached to the opposite seat, took a folded wool rug, and set it beside her without ceremony. Use it! I am wet. I will ruin it. Use it! She drew it around her knees because refusing again would be childish pride. Heat rose from the heavy weave in slow increments and made her fingers ache as feeling returned. The ache sharpened thought. She gave him 2 more figures. A warehouse fee entered against the wrong vessel. A solicitor payment in Mrs. Kelly's hand, charged to estate repair. He asked for names, clerks, witnesses, dates of weather delays, and she answered each one as if reciting prayer. By the time they passed the toll house north of the inn, the rain had settled into a fine cold sheet, and the light had gone the colour of pewter. The Duke rapped once on the roof, and the carriage turned through a side gate Linda did not know, then climbed a curved drive lined with bare elms toward a stone house set back from the road and lit at every lower window. Ravenscar House rose in steps and columns, severe and orderly, built to be seen from a distance and feared up close. She had carried notes to its steward's office once, never beyond the servant entrance. Tonight the main doors stood open under a lantern glare, footmen waiting in black and silver livery, their faces unreadable. The Duke stepped down first. A footman set her trunk on the top step, intact, cord uncut. Another reached for it and glanced at her for instruction rather than assuming. The small courtesy struck her harder than the cold had. Inside, heat hit her skin like pain. Wax, polished oak, damp wool, the sharp, clean bite of spirits from a sideboard. The hall ceiling rose 2 stories above a black and white marble floor veined like ice. A woman in housekeeper's grey came forward, broad-shouldered, iron hair pinned smooth, keys at her waist. Mrs. Davies, the Duke said, Miss Kelly is under my protection. Dry clothes, hot food, a room near the west stairs. Her trunk remains locked unless she permits otherwise. Mrs. Davies inclined her head to him, then to Linda, taking in torn sleeves, swollen knuckles, soaked hem, and not flinching from any of it. Yes, Your Grace, Linda found her voice. My lord, your brother! A commotion rose from the outer court before he could answer. Wheels grinding over stone, men shouting in clipped bursts. The Duke turned sharply toward the doors. 2 grooms came in backward carrying a stretcher, improvised from carriage cushions and a stable blanket. Lord Adrian lay on it, face grey under rainwater, hands jerking in broken rhythm against his chest. "Doctor," Mercer followed, hatless, spectacles fogged, coat half buttoned as if he had dressed while running. "He worsened before we cleared the inn yard," Mercer said. "Pulse racing, tremor generalised, breathing shallow. I need him in a dark room and still." "Blue room," the Duke said. "Nearest the physician's stair." They moved at once. Linda took one step after them, then stopped because she was no one here. Mrs. Davies touched her sleeve lightly. "Miss, come to the kitchen fire first." From the stair landing above came the sound of Adrian retching, then a hoarse cry cut short. Linda turned toward it before she decided to. Her body had already learned his pattern in the yard. Breath trapped, cravat too tight, noise pressing from all sides. "He cannot lie flat," she said. "If he does, his chest locks." "Doctor," Mercer looked back over the banister, impatient and tired. "And you are?" "The woman who kept him breathing on the stones." Mercer's eyes narrowed behind wet lenses, then dropped to her hands as she demonstrated with 2 fingers, at her own throat, the angle she had used, the way his jaw had clenched. "Bring her," he said. Mrs. Davies released her sleeve. Linda followed the men up the stairs, leaving wet prints on polished wood and hearing very distinctly one footman inhale as if to object. The Duke did not look at the footman. That was enough to silence him. The blue room had been prepared for guests, not illness. Velvet drapes, gilt mirror, a bed too soft for a body in distress. Adrian was half propped against pillows, trying to push away anyone who touched him, his breath cutting in jagged pulls. One hand shook so violently the signet rang against the bedpost in a bright, irregular tap. Mercer reached for a vial. "No spirits," Linda said. Mercer snapped. "Stand back! He told your man no spirits in the yard. They worsen him." The Duke's voice entered before the argument could widen. "Doctor," Mercer paused, jaw tight. "A measured sedative may blunt the tremor." "Then measure it," the Duke said, "and listen to her first." Mercer gave a short nod that admitted neither agreement nor gratitude. "What did you do?" "Loosened his throat linen, kept his head turned, counted his breath aloud so he could follow." "Count now." Linda moved to the bedside, not near his face where panic might strike, but where he could see her without turning. "My lord, look at me if you can." His eyes found her and slid away, then returned with effort. "In for 4, hold for 2, out for 6. His first attempt failed. Second failed. Third caught halfway. She kept counting. Low. Even. The room was full of men who carried titles and salaries and deference from everyone they met. Not one of them could lend him steadiness. She lent it because she had nothing else to offer. Mercer mixed drops into water, handed it to her rather than to the footman, and watched as she tipped the glass when Adrian's jaw unclenched. Half spilled, half went down. "Enough." "Again," she said. "In for 4. The Duke stood at the far side of the bed, hands behind his back, motionless as carved stone. He had removed gloves and laid them on the mantel with military precision. His eyes tracked every detail. Adrian's pulse at the throat, Mercer's dosage, Linda's voice, the way her own fingers shook once, then steadied when Adrian's did. After 10 minutes, the violent rhythm eased to a hard, constant tremor. After 20, his breaths lengthened by increments. Mercer listened to his chest and finally sat back with a tired exhale. "He must be observed through the night," he said. "No strong drink, no loud stimuli. If spasms return, send for me at once." The Duke gave orders with clipped efficiency. A cot for the physician in the adjoining room. A footman stationed at the corridor end. Lamps trimmed low. No visitors admitted without his word. Then he turned to Linda. "Mrs. Davies will take you down now." Adrian's hand shot out and caught Linda's cuff, with surprising strength. His eyes opened in alarm, unfocused but urgent. "Do not—" The rest dissolved into a tremor that took his jaw. Linda looked at his fingers locked in wet cloth, then at the Duke. "If he wakes frightened, he will fight every servant in this room. Let me stay until he sleeps." "You have been on your feet since dawn." "I know. You require heat and food." "So does he." The Duke held her gaze for a long beat that felt like standing on a threshold with no clear side to choose. Then he gave one short nod. 1 hour. It became longer without anyone announcing it. Mercer dozed upright in a chair and started awake each time Adrian's breath hitched. A maid brought broth and left it untouched at Linda's elbow because each time she reached for the spoon, Adrian's hand tightened again on her sleeve, as if movement itself were abandonment. At one point his eyes opened wide in terror, fixed on the curtain cords as if they were rifle smoke and open ground. Linda put her palm flat on the blanket where he could see it, and counted again, quieter this time, until the panic receded. By the time the long case clock in the corridor struck 9, the rain had thinned to a mist against the glass. Her wet dress had dried stiff at the seams. Her shoulders burned from holding the same position. Hunger moved through her in slow, hollow waves that she set aside each time Adrian jerked awake. At 9:30, the Duke came in without sound. She did not hear him until she felt the shift in the room's attention. Mercer rose at once. Linda remained where she was, fingers resting near Adrian's wrist. The Duke looked at the untouched tray, then at her face gone pale with fatigue. "You were told 1 hour," he said. "He has woken 7 times." "That is not your duty. Tonight it is." He stood very still. "Mrs. Kelly set this errand to punish you." "Yes, she will punish you for delay." "Yes, and still you remain." Adrian made a broken sound and tried to sit. Linda pressed his shoulder gently. "Stay down, my lord. Breathe first." The Duke watched her hand on his brother's sleeve, the instinctive care in a woman with no reason to spend herself for Blackthorn blood. When he spoke again, the words were directed to Mercer, though his eyes did not leave Linda. "Describe his risk." Mercer rubbed his brow. "Another severe episode before dawn is likely. The tremor cycle may recur if he wakes disoriented. Can trained servants manage it? Not without force. Would force worsen it? Yes." Silence settled. Firelight shifted over the Duke's profile, sharpening the scar near his temple Linda had not noticed in the yard. At last he turned toward the door. "Mrs. Davies," he called. The housekeeper appeared almost immediately, as if she had been waiting just outside. He gave instructions in the same tone he used for legal orders. "Miss Kelly will have dry clothes brought here, food here, tea and coal through the night, a screen for privacy. No one questions her presence." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Davies's eyes moved once to Linda, not unkind, not curious, merely practical. "I will fetch what is needed." When she had gone, the Duke addressed Linda without preamble. "If you remain, you follow Dr. Mercer's direction precisely." "I will." "You wake him by name if his breathing alters?" "I know his pattern." A pause. "So I saw." He left the room then, closing the door softly behind him. Linda had expected relief at his absence. Instead, the room seemed to hold his scrutiny after he was gone, as if he had set it in place like another instrument. Mrs. Davies returned with ruthless efficiency. A plain wool gown, stockings, warm bricks wrapped in flannel, a tray of broth, bread and tea, strong enough to sting the nose. She erected a folding screen near the hearth and ordered a maid to wring out Linda's shawl by the scullery fire. Linda changed in 2 minutes, hands clumsy with tiredness. then drank broth standing up because our sitting risked sleep. The heat hit her empty stomach and almost made her dizzy. "You will take bread as well," Mrs. Davis said. "I cannot chew quietly enough." Mrs. Davis tore the bread into small pieces and set them in Linda's palm without comment. The gesture was brisk, nearly stern, and kinder than sympathy. At 10, Adrian woke with another tremor. At 11, less severe. At midnight, he whispered for water and held the glass himself, though his hand shook so hard it struck his teeth. Linda took it back before it spilled and did not remark on the tremor. Men like him had been punished for that weakness in places she could only imagine. She had no intention of repeating the punishment in this room. Shortly after 1, footsteps paused outside the half-open door. Linda glanced up and saw the Duke in the corridor shadow, not entering, not announcing himself. He watched as she adjusted the lampwick lower, as she checked Adrian's pulse with the back of 2 fingers, and counted under her breath, as she moved the ewer farther from the bed, so a sudden jerk would not send it shattering to the floor. Practical acts, exact acts, the kind no audience applauded. He remained there for several minutes, silent as winter, then stepped away. The hours stretched and folded. At 2, Adrian slept a full 20 minutes without a start. At 3, rain returned in a light tapping against the panes. Linda's neck stiffened. Her eyelids burned. She stood once, crossed to the window for one lungful of colder air, and came back before the mattress rope had stopped creaking. Each return seemed to steady him more than medicine did. Near 4, Mercer woke with a snort, checked pulse and pupils, and gave a grunt that might have been approval. "He is through the worst of this cycle," he murmured. "If he reaches dawn without full seizure, he may keep clear." Linda nodded and resumed counting when Adrian's breath shortened again. At some point in that last dark hour, Adrian opened his eyes and focused fully for the first time since the inn. Shame came first, then memory. "I warned you to leave," he whispered. "You did. You should have." "Perhaps." His mouth twitched with effort that did not become a smile. "You are stubborn." "So I am told." His gaze drifted toward the door where no one stood now. "Did he force you to stay?" "No. I asked." Adrian closed his eyes briefly, a man absorbing cost. "Then I owe you." She thought of Mrs. Kelly's ink, of attic cold, of years calculated to make her small, and answered with the only currency she trusted. "You owe the truth when it is asked of you." His hand, still trembling, moved once on the coverlet and came to rest. Outside, the first grey of dawn began to dilute the black window panes. Inside, the lamps burned low. The fire had settled to red core and ash, and Linda remained upright in the chair at his side, counting each measured breath as if numbers could hold a life in place until morning made it legal to hope. Dawn bled slowly into the room, a thin grey wash over velvet drapes and cooling coals, and Linda was still counting under her breath when the corridor clock struck 5. Adrian's breathing had steadied to a fragile rhythm. Not strong, not yet safe enough to trust without listening, but steadier. "Doctor." Mercer rose from his cot in the adjoining room, pressed 2 fingers to Adrian's wrist, checked his pupils, and nodded once as if granting a temporary reprieve to a man who had not earned many. "He is through this turn," the physician said quietly. "If he sleeps another hour, he will wake clear." Relief did not arrive as warmth. It arrived as weakness. Linda felt it in her knees, in the tremor that returned to her hands now that someone else had spoken the words. She stood carefully, one palm on the chair back so the room would not tilt, and stepped away from the bed for the first time in hours. At the doorway she nearly walked into the Duke. He had no hat now, no gloves, no greatcoat, only a dark waistcoat and shirt sleeves rolled once at the forearm, as if he had begun to undress for rest and then abandoned the thought. Stubble darkened his jaw. His eyes looked unchanged, hard and exact. Yet the stillness in him had altered. He did not start at seeing her there. He had expected her movement before she made it. "You require food," he said. She heard her own voice answer from a distance. "I can eat on the road." "No!" It was not louder than before. It landed harder. Linda gathered the wool shawl Mrs. Davies had dried and folded near the hearth. "Your brother is stable. You have your witness statement in part. I must return before—" "No!" He stepped aside to let Mercer pass with his case, then closed the door to the bedchamber halfway, reducing the room to low light and breathing silence. Only then did he look directly at her hands. Red knuckles, split skin at the thumb, fine shaking she could no longer hide now that the urgency had eased. "You cannot hold a pen in that condition," he said. "You cannot sign deposition papers. You cannot even manage your trunk latch. You will eat first. Then the house steward will take your formal account." She tightened the shawl across her chest. "If I do not return this morning, Mrs. Kelly will declare me runaway and thief by noon. She will do so regardless." The bluntness struck. She drew a careful breath. "Then I should be present to answer." "You will answer before a magistrate, not in her drawing-room." In the half-open doorway behind him, Adrian shifted and made a small, broken sound in sleep. Linda turned instinctively. The Duke watched the movement. "You have done enough for him," he said. "Enough is not a useful word in a sick room." For the first time his mouth moved at one corner. Not quite a smile. Something briefer and more tired. "Mrs. Davies said you refused bread because chewing was too loud." "She exaggerates." "She does not." He reached past her to the small side table and lifted the untouched cup of tea gone cold hours ago, looked at it once, and set it down again, as if even that small neglect had become evidence in a case he was building. Then he said, in the same flat tone he used for orders to staff, "Come with me." She followed because her legs would not carry argument much farther, and because the corridor beyond the blue room had emptied in the way great houses did after a night emergency. Servants withdrawn to corners, doors closed, rugs damp where boots had tracked rain. The windows along the west passage held a colourless dawn. Ravenscar House had the hush of a battlefield after cannon smoke, ordered, scrubbed, and waiting for the next command. By the time they reached a small morning room overlooking the inner court, the kitchen fire had found strength. Mrs. Davies stood by a sideboard with a tray already set. Broth, oat bread, poached eggs, and tea fresh enough to steam. She looked from the Duke to Linda and seemed unsurprised by either expression. "I will send for fresh coals in 10 minutes, she said. Then to Linda, "Sit, miss." Linda sat. Mrs. Davies poured tea, set a cup near Linda's right hand where the split thumb would not catch the handle, and departed without one wasted gesture. The Duke remained standing by the mantel, one hand braced against the stone, eyes on the courtyard where rain had thinned to a silver mist. Linda broke the bread. Her fingers protested each tear of crust. She did not realize how ravenous she was until she swallowed the first mouthful and felt her stomach clench around it like a fist. The Duke spoke without turning. "There is a man in a brown cap who has been in and out of that inn-yard 3 times this week. He reports to Hatherley." She froze with the cup halfway to her mouth. "You know him." "I know his employer's habits." She set the cup down carefully. "You said in the carriage I was carrying evidence tied to your estates. You knew before you opened the packet." He turned then. "I suspected." "Because of the disputed trust?" Because of the pattern. He crossed to the table and laid a folded paper beside her plate. Not Mrs. Kelly's hand, his own sharp and spare. Your father's Bristol accounts have shown anomalies for 18 months. Twice I sent inquiries through proper channels. Twice Mrs. Kelly replied that a grieving ward had become fixated on figures beyond her understanding. A pulse of heat rose through Linda, pure and humiliating. And you believed her. I believed she was buying time. Silence thickened between them. She looked down at the folded sheet and saw names she recognized from old ledgers, dates that matched her memory, and notes in the margin that proved he had indeed been watching numbers while she had been counting alone in the attic. The knowledge felt like relief and anger braided too tightly to separate. You could have written to me, she said. You were not permitted correspondence unsupervised. She looked up sharply. He met her gaze without flinching. Your letters were opened in Hatherley's still room before posting. 3 were burned last winter. The room seemed to narrow. She had written only once last winter, a brief page to an old clerk in Bristol asking for duplicate manifests. She had waited 2 months for a reply that never came and told herself the silence meant caution or distance or indifference. Not ash in a grate. Ash watched by a woman in silk. How do you know this? She asked. His answer came after a beat. Because one of the maids dismissed from Hatherley entered service here in March. She thought she was reporting the kitchen gossip. She was not. Linda stared at him. He had watched from farther away than she had guessed, through servants and ledgers and men in brown caps, through roots that touched her life without ever touching her hand. The anger remained, but it had nowhere clean to land. You investigated my house, she said. I investigated fraud linked to my tenants and my brother's liabilities. And me, a pause, you were in the records. She almost laughed at the cruelty of the phrasing. Not a person, a notation, a dependent line item under dispute. She tore another piece of bread because her hands needed work. Then the records now show I've delayed all night and failed the terms of my errand, she said. Mrs. Kelly will make that useful by noon. She will not reach noon with impunity. He moved to the writing desk by the window and opened a leather portfolio. Inside were 3 sealed notes. One bore Ravenscar's crest. One bore a magistrate's stamp already impressed in wax. One, unsealed, lay open with a list of items in precise columns. I sent these at 4, he said. First, to Magistrate Ellery requesting immediate hearing on alleged trust fraud and coercive debt instruments. Second, to Inspector Hale in Bath with notice of possible extortion and unlawful confinement. Third, to Hatherley, informing Mrs. Kelly that you are a material witness under my protection pending sworn testimony. Linda set down her bread. Under your protection, she repeated. Yes. Without my consent. His expression hardened a fraction. With your survival in mind. I did not ask to be removed from my house under ducal authority like contraband. He took one step toward her. You were already being moved like contraband, Miss Kelly. In rain, on foot, beside luggage you were forbidden to ride with, carrying legal papers intended to bury you if challenged. Do not mistake the form of violence for its absence. The words hit with brutal clarity because they were true. She hated that they were true. She hated more that he named them cleanly when she had spent years translating the same injuries into acceptable language. She rose too quickly, steadied herself on the chair, and faced him at full height despite the shaking in her calves. I will testify, I will provide every figure I hold, but I will not exchange one jailer for another, however polished the room. Something changed in his face then. Not anger, not wounded pride, a controlled recognition, as if she had finally spoken in the only terms he considered honest. "Good," he said. The single word startled her more than rebuke would have. He came closer until only the corner of the table stood between them. Close, she saw the strain at the edges of his composure, the fine red line in the whites of his eyes from a sleepless night, the small scar near his temple pulled tight when his jaw set. "Then hear me precisely," he said. "I am not asking for gratitude. I am issuing terms of safety. You will not return to Hatherley. You will not meet Mrs. Kelly alone. You will not travel without escort until this case is heard. If you defy any one of these, she will break you in ways law cannot mend quickly enough." His hand flattened on the tabletop near hers. He did not touch her. The restraint itself felt like contact. "You will remain where I can keep you safe." The sentence entered the room and stayed there. It was command in grammar, confession in weight, not affection, not softness. Something more dangerous than either, because it admitted necessity he could no longer pretend was administrative. Linda felt the old reflex rise, that immediate urge to refuse any order simply because it was an order. Under it came another truth, unwelcome and clear. Her body had recognized danger in that inn-yard before her mind named it. Her body recognized shelter now in this bright room she did not own. The distinction shamed her and steadied her in equal measure. She looked down at his hand, broad and still against the polished wood, and saw a faint tremor at the thumb joint he had hidden from everyone else. Fatigue, perhaps. Anger held too long. Fear for his brother. She could not tell. She only knew he had stood in doorways all night like a sentry, and had not trusted sleep while she watched Adrian breathe. "How long were you in the corridor?" she asked quietly. His eyes held hers. "Since 1?" She blinked once. "You did not go to bed." "No." "You had staff enough to wake you if needed?" "Yes." "Then why stand there?" He did not answer at once. Outside, a carriage rolled across the inner court, wheels whispering over wet stone. Somewhere below, a maid laughed once and was hushed. Morning had begun, ordinary and indifferent. At last he said, "Because if he stopped breathing, I wanted to be at the door before anyone called." She understood the sentence. She understood, too, the part he had not spoken. If she collapsed in that chair, if fear or hunger or exhaustion took her, he had wanted to see it before a servant did. She sat again because her knees had begun to tremble in earnest. He moved back by one measured pace, granting distance without retreat. The space was a courtesy she recognized for what it was. "Eat," he said, quieter now. "Then write your statement while details are sharp." She lifted the cup. This time her hand shook less. From the corridor came quick footsteps and a discreet knock. Mrs. Davies entered with a folded note on a tray. "From the West Gate, Your Grace, rider from Hatherley." The Duke took the note, broke the seal, and read. Nothing in his expression shifted, yet the room seemed to cool by degrees. "Well?" Linda asked. He handed her the page. Mrs. Kelly's hand slanted across the paper like a blade. "Return the girl at once. She has stolen household documents and valuables. Delay will compel me to involve the county constable." Linda read it twice. Fear moved through her, old and practised. Then she set the note down beside her plate and reached for the pen Mrs. Davies had already placed by the blotter. "Bring me the deposition sheets," she said to no one in particular, then looked at the Duke. "If I am to remain where you can keep me safe, Your Grace, we begin with the truth in ink." His gaze dropped to the pen in her raw fingers, then rose to her face. He gave a single curt nod that felt less like permission than accord. "Mrs. Davies," he said, "lock the west door. Admit no messenger without my order." The housekeeper inclined her head. At once. Linda bent over the blank page, pain flaring in her split thumb as she wrote the first line of her sworn account, and across from her the Duke of Blackthorn did not sit, did not leave, did not look away. Ink dragged at first. Her thumb split wider on the downstrokes. Mrs. Davies laid a strip of linen beside the blotter without comment, and Linda wrapped it tight, then wrote again, line after line in a hand that steadied as facts replaced fear. She listed dates, vessel names, copied sums, and the attic inventory she had kept in secret. 2 dismissed servants, 3 missing account books, 1 still-room grate where correspondence had been burned. When her wrist cramped, the Duke moved the sand shaker within reach and said only, "Continue!" By the time the corridor clock struck 7, the deposition sheets were full. The packet papers lay weighted under a brass seal, and her trunk stood open at last by her own word, its lining cut back to reveal the scraps she had hidden for years. She placed each scrap on the table herself. Mrs. Davies numbered them. The Ravenscar steward entered each as evidence in a ledger headed for Magistrate Ellery's court. At 8:30, Inspector Hale arrived from Bath with 2 constables, boots wet to the ankle, and expressions already sharpened by the scale of what had been laid before them. He read the Duke's note, then Linda's statement, then the copied columns from the packet and the trunk lining. He asked no foolish question about whether a lady could balance books. He asked where the original ledgers were kept, who held the key ring, which clerk had transposed entries, and who carried messages between Hatherley and the inn yards. The Duke answered what he knew. Linda answered the rest. When Hale heard about the man in the brown cap, he called 1 constable to the window and pointed into the court where a stable hand waited with a witness from the inn. By noon, the brown-capped messenger sat in Ravenscar's gate lodge, under guard, wet cap in his lap, giving up names in exchange for leniency he had not earned. Adrian came to the morning room just before they departed for the magistrate, pale and exhausted, hands still unsteady at his sides. Dr. Mercer walked 1 step behind him, like a shadow prepared to catch a fall. Adrian looked first at Linda, then at the pages on the table. "You wrote all night," he said. "I wrote what I could prove." He swallowed, jaw tight with effort. "Then I will prove the rest." The Duke moved to him at once, not touching, merely close enough that Adrian could lean if he needed. "You are not fit for a public chamber." "I am fit enough to tell the truth once." Adrian's breath shook. He looked at Linda again. "You asked me why I trembled. I answered badly. I will answer properly where it binds." They rode in separate carriages through thinning rain. By the first week of November, Bath's streets had taken on that iron colour that made every window reflection look like judgment. Magistrate Ellery's hearing room smelled of wet wool, sealing wax and old paper. Benches filled early. News had outrun protocol. Mrs. Kelly arrived in plum silk and rosewater, with Helena and Clara in matching bonnets and faces composed for pity. Her first glance at Linda was a blade wrapped in velvet. Her second glance at the Duke measured rank and adjusted strategy. When the clerk called the case, Ellery demanded documents before speeches. Hale submitted the seized packet. The Ravenscar steward submitted Linda's deposition and the scraps from her trunk lining. A clerk from Bristol, white-faced and sweating through his collar, submitted duplicate manifests he had once withheld. The dismissed maid from Hatherley, Martha Pike, testified under oath that letters addressed by Linda had been opened in the still room and fed to the grate on Mrs. Kelly's instruction. The room shifted at that. People who had come for scandal began to hear structure. Mrs. Kelly rose when called, chin lifted. "This is a malicious tale by an ungrateful dependent and men who wish to strip a widow." Ellery did not blink. "You may answer after evidence is read," she pointed at Linda anyway. "She stole household papers and valuables and fled to Ravenscar to trade lies for patronage." Linda stood when her turn came, hands flat on the rail so the tremor would not show. She walked the court through June 16th, August 21st, September's false hand. She explained transposed columns without flourish, using chalk on a slate Ellery's clerk set out for jurists to follow. Liability to credit, credit to liability, a duplicated line turning solvency into debt. She named every correction and every source. When Mrs. Kelly laughed at her, soft and contemptuous, Linda did not look at her. She looked at the numbers, and the room followed her gaze. Then Ellery called Adrian Blackthorne. He crossed the floor more slowly than he would once have allowed. A murmur passed as his hand shook against the witness rail. Ellery asked the formal question first. "Lord Adrian, you warned Miss Kelly at the inn to leave. Why?" Adrian's throat worked. He looked briefly toward his brother, then back to the magistrate. "Because she has ruled us all by fear, and I let her." Silence hit the chamber like a dropped curtain. Helena's fan stopped mid-motion. Clara looked down at once. Mrs. Kelly's composure cracked for the first time. Adrian continued, voice thin but clear. He testified to debts pressed upon him in private letters, to laudanum offered as remedy and leverage, to threats that Linda would be married off under forged obligation if he spoke against altered books. He admitted his own weakness without staging it as virtue. He did not ask pardon. He gave facts. Hale then produced the brown-capped messenger, who confirmed he had been paid from Hatherley accounts to watch coach yards and report Linda's contacts. He had carried sealed notes to a solicitor known for coercive settlements. He identified the man in open court. The solicitor, summoned and sweating, denied memory until Ellery ordered contempt noted. Memory returned within seconds. By late afternoon, the hearing ended. Ellery removed spectacles, cleaned them with deliberate care, and delivered judgment in a voice stripped of ornament. All claims against Linda Kelly based on the disputed debt packet were void for fraud. Temporary management of the Kelly Trust was terminated. Immediate custodial control passed to an independent trustee, pending formal court execution of transfer, with Linda's authority over household and estate expenditures recognised at once. Mrs. Kelly was remanded for charges of extortion, document forgery, coercive marriage conspiracy, and unlawful confinement. Helena and Clara, not charged, were ordered removed from trust premises, pending civil review. Constables stepped forward before Mrs. Kelly could gather her silk for dignity. Rosewater lifted sharp in the room as she turned on Linda. "You think this makes you mistress of anything?" Linda met her eyes. "No, the records made me heir before you arrived." Mrs. Kelly lunged one half step, as if to strike. A constable caught her wrist in the air. Gasps rose from the back benches. The same county mouths that had laughed from coach windows now watched her, led away between uniforms, skirts whispering over stone, power reduced to process. The next morning Linda returned to Hatherley with Inspector Hale, Mrs. Davies, and 2 clerks. Rain had stopped. Frost silvered the paddock rails. She did not enter by the servant door. She crossed the front threshold with the trustee's order in her glove and the key ring handed over by Hale after inventory. In the attic nursery she opened the warped chest at the foot of the cot and removed what remained: her mother's shawl, her father's hymn book, 3 account notebooks, and the crust-stained handkerchief she no longer needed. In the still-room grate she found fused lumps of old wax and half-burned paper. Hale bagged them, though no text survived. "Noted as destroyed," he said, and wrote it down. In the drawing room, she signed wage restorations for the servants dismissed without cause and pensions for 2 older staff forced out under economies. Martha Pike was reinstated by her own choice as correspondence clerk, with keys logged and witnessed. Linda ordered every outgoing letter registered at dispatch, no exceptions. When she locked the attic door that evening, she left the key in the hall cabinet, visible to anyone who passed. 3 months later, on a clear afternoon in February, the west lawn at Ravenscar held a brittle sunlight and the thaw smell of wet earth. Adrian, stronger and under Mercer's care, stood without visible tremor for nearly a full minute while speaking with his brother about tenant rents. He caught Linda watching from the terrace and gave the smallest incline of thanks before returning to his figures. He had kept his word in court, and afterward, each difficult day counted openly, not performed. The Duke found Linda in the library where her father's salvaged ledgers now sat beside Ravenscar tenant books in orderly rows. He closed the door but did not cross the room at once. Distance first, always distance first. "I have come to ask a question," he said. She set down her pen. "Then ask it plainly." "I wish to court you with public intention." She held his gaze. "Under terms." "Name them." "No commands in place of explanation where my person is concerned. My estate remains under my signature. The Hatherley schoolroom is reopened for servants' daughters and funded yearly. Adrian's care remains supervised regardless of politics. If we disagree on household matters, disagreement is spoken in private, not enforced in corridors." He listened without interruption, face unreadable except for that minute tightening at the temple scar when he measured each clause. "Accepted," he said, "all of it." She waited, then added the last and hardest. "And if I say, 'No now, Ravenscar protection does not vanish tomorrow'?" His answer came without delay. "It does not." Only then did she nod. They were married in daylight in the parish church 6 weeks later, with Ellery among the witnesses and Mrs. Davies standing near enough to adjust Linda's veil, when wind lifted it at the porch. There was no spectacle beyond what law required and community understood. At the signing table, Linda wrote Kelly first, then Blackthorne, her hand steady across both names. Outside, the road was clear, no rain, no mud, no trunk dragged beside wheels. That evening, when the house had quieted and the last guest carriage had gone, Linda stood at the window of her own room and watched the west gate close under guard at the appointed hour, not to keep her in, but to keep danger out. Behind her, the Duke paused in the doorway and waited until she turned of her own accord before he said, very low, "Home." And this time the word did not sound like an order.